Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Dewey Book Club. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Abby.
And our topic for this month was free choice, so any nonfiction book that our readers wanted to read for this month. The book that I read is called Come Fly the World, The Jet Age Story of the Women of Pan Am by Julia Cook. And I chose this book because one of my interests is in vintage aviation, and this is a really interesting look at kind of the myth of sort of the golden age of aviation and then the reality of the women that worked, particularly for Pan Am Airlines during this time. So one of the interesting things actually I learned at the beginning of the book, it goes into just kind of the history of how flight attendants came on board the aircraft. And one thing I didn't know was actually that a lot of the original flight attendants were men. And then it was actually a nurse and a pilot that was able to convince the airline executives in the early 30s that having a trained nurse on board the aircraft would be more qualified to assist passengers during the flight. But one of the interesting things, and it's one of the themes of this book, is basically how highly qualified these flight attendants had to be, but then also how gender conforming their roles were and all the stereotypes towards them. So the argument from the nurse she did convince the airline that, that they would make better flight attendants. However, the airline then also, one of the ideas they had was that it would actually be better to have women on board because it would actually ease the male passengers on board, that if a woman wasn't worried on the flight, why should the men be worried? So that's kind of how it started with women as flight attendants on board the aircraft. This book really goes into the women that worked for Pan Am from like the 1950s to the 1970s. And there were a lot of strict qualifications on the flight attendants. So they had to be between 5'3" to 5'9", between 105 to 140 pounds and under the age of 26. However, then at the same time, there was a mandatory retirement age of either 32 or 35, depending on the airline. Wow. And then also if they had to be single. So if they got married at any time, that would end their careers. As it's actually says in the book, one of the airline executives, they were concerned about married women either missing work too much, gaining weight, or their husbands calling to complain to the airline that their wives were away from home too much. But then despite these very narrow qualifications that these women had to meet, they also had to have a college degree. They had to speak at least 2 languages. And then the other interesting thing too, so a lot of being a flight attendant obviously is like safety training and like how to evacuate the aircraft in an emergency, but particularly for Pan Am, because Pan Am flew internationally and flew to a lot of areas where there were like conflict going on. These women also had to be prepared for things like hijackings and like landing in like basically like war zones and stuff like that. So really, very, very tough job. And actually the interesting thing is despite these very tight qualifications, there's actually only about 3 to 5% of women that applied that actually were able to become flight attendants actually. So, wow. And it talks about in the book, that's actually because this was one of the few careers that was available to unmarried women at that time in the 1950s and 1960s. And in particular, it gave them a lot of freedom to travel the world, see parts of the world that they might not otherwise be able to do at that time. So what I really liked about the book, it actually focuses a lot on the personal stories of the flight attendants that worked at Pan Am at that time. So she actually interviewed a lot of the flight attendants that are still living from that time, which is actually quite a few because, this really wasn't that long ago. And a lot of these women were very young when they were working. So that really kind of humanizes their story and kind of gives you some more insight into how they got into the field of being a flight attendant and then also working for Pan Am. So one of the stories it actually starts out with is a woman that was one of the graduated from college in the 1960s with a science degree. I think it was a biology degree, I believe, but just didn't really find that satisfying, even though she was one of the few women in that field. So this was like an exciting opportunity for her to go travel and just do something that she thought was more exciting. There's also a chapter that chronicles some of the African-American flight attendants that fought discrimination at the airline in the 1960s. They graduated flight attendant school, done very well in the school, but then they're having trouble getting hired by the airline. So it chronicles some of their fight to get employment with Pan Am. And then the latter half of the book goes into some of the world events that Pan Am played a role in that I actually didn't know about. So one of the things that they did a lot of was during the Vietnam War, they flew flights into and out of Saigon for the troops that were stationed in Vietnam fighting. For their 5 days of rest and relaxation, they flew them out of Saigon and then into other areas, mostly in Asia there. The other thing they were also involved in was something called Operation Baby Lift, which evacuated thousands of children during the fall of Saigon. So it really does a really good job of chronicling the very stressful work these women had to do, whether just on a regular flight or in these sorts of situations. As I said, it's a really interesting book. This obviously is an airline that doesn't exist anymore. It's a time period that, fortunately, in many ways does not exist anymore either. It really does a good job of actually focusing on the people that actually lived and worked during this time and kind of dispelling some of the myths of the golden age of aviation. A lot of what we think of this time period as far as aviation goes is from like advertising that still remains during that time, or from like TV and movies, which all were very tightly controlled to project a certain image, which, certainly was not necessarily the reality. So if you have any interest in like vintage aviation, it's a really interesting look at the people that worked during that time.
Awesome. That sounds like a really interesting book. All right. So the book I chose for this month is called Films of Endearment, A Mother and Son and the 80s Films That Defined Us by Michael Kowarski. This book is kind of part memoir, part film analysis, mainly films from the whole decade from 1980 to 1989. Michael Kowarski is himself a film critic, and he kind of does a little bit credit this to his love of film that his mother gave to him, and they grew in his childhood. So some of his fondest memories from childhood were going to the video store, and again, this is also in the 80s. He grew up in the 80s, by the way. Some of his favorite memories were going to the video store with his mom, picking out a movie, and then going home and sitting on the couch and just bonding over a really fun movie with his mom. And it is after his father is going through Alzheimer's, and he's kind of seeing his father deteriorate. This is later on, like when he's in his 40s now. It's after he's kind of watching his father kind of deteriorate through Alzheimer's that he wants to reconnect with his mother and kind of share and build new memories and remember old memories with her, that they decide to pick a decade of their favorite movies and rewatch them. And it's a big surprise to him that when he asked his mother what was her favorite decade for movies, and he kind of expects her to pick like from the 50s or the 60s, especially the 60s and 70s, because that's when she was growing up and that's when she was in college. Like she was in college in the 60s and 70s, where film was taking a big turn. Just production and story and storyline and everything. But she admitted that her favorite decade is the 80s which is really like, formative years with, that's during his childhood. And then a lot of the movies like they watched when he was growing up. And she says it's mainly because she identified with a lot of the female characters that were being portrayed in 80s movies. And he even kind of coins a new term in his book where he feels that the 80s were kind of like the decade of the woman for at least for movies, where he, at least from his perspective, you kind of see a shift in film in the 80s, where it's like women are portrayed as not just wives and mothers or side characters. They're the main protagonists, and they have their own stories going on. He picks 10 movies they watched, and he goes through their memories together, their favorite parts of the movies. He also does a bit of a film analysis for each one, like going into what was going on behind the film and the actresses involved. And the movies they watched were like movies like 9 to 5 with Jane Fonda and Dolly Parton, and Terms of Endearment was with Shirley MacLaine, and even the movie Aliens with Sigourney Weaver, which I think is considered one of the like the first action movies with a main female protagonist and a main female survivor. So it's a really interesting type of writing style and just type of book, where it is like it's part memoir and describing this really deep mother-son bond over a shared interest, especially something with film and pop culture, which is I think everybody has a bit of not a hand, but everyone can connect with it. Also, it's a little bit of a film analysis and going to some of these favorite movies. I mean, if you never watch these movies, you probably won't enjoy this book. If you've never seen 9 to 5 or Terms of Endearment or anything else, you might not get too interested in that part. But she just does a really good job of describing this relationship he has with his mom, and how even growing up, when he was a kid in the 80s and his mom showed him these movies, it was not only that, of course, it was a different experience for his mother, as she's like a woman in her 30s and 40s and being able to watch these female characters on the screen, but it was also really a good influence for him as a young man, showing how he kind of felt that he learned what women can do also. And he does also kind of admit that this this bond he had with his mom, and these movies about these very strong women that they shared with, also has like helped him kind of come out to his mother later on. He identifies as a gay man later on, and he also just kind of credits this bond with his mother that they formed as a child. And also it's like these movies, these very good, influential movies, that he kind of made him feel comfortable enough to come out to his mother and his family later on. It's a really sweet story of his relationship with his mom, and just how just stuff in pop culture, like movies, can really like bring people together. And very good. Highly recommend this book.
That sounds really interesting. I like a lot of 80 movies too. Exactly. So it sounds like something I would like. So we asked our email list to share what they read for this month's free choice topic. So we're going to go ahead and share some of those reviews. The first two that I'm going to share are from Carol. The first book that she read is called 6 Car Lengths Behind an Elephant, behind Lillian McCloy. The author, her husband worked as a deep cover CIA foreign agent, and this book tells of her life primarily living in Spain, India, and Tokyo during that time while he's working with the CIA, and then her trials and tribulations of raising 3 children abroad on a meager CIA salary. Carol said that she liked the author's dry humor and wit, and those both served her very well in the author's life abroad. And then the second book that Carol read that sounds really interesting is called 80 Days, Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland's History-Making Race Around the World by Matthew Goodman. This is a true story that takes place in 1889 and describes the quest of the 2 female journalists traveling around the world in opposite directions by steamship and train in a race to better Jules Verne's fictional 80 Days Around the World. Carol said this book features alternating chapters between the 2 reporters, and that kept the book moving along and made for an interesting read.
Oh, nice. All right. And so I'm going to read reviews from JJ. JJ also read 2 books. Her first book is Red Scorpion by Pete Saskin. It says this book is about the USS Rasher during World War II. The submarine was built during World War II and was one of the most successful subs during the war. She says the book gives a good and exciting history about the USS Rasher and its 8 war patrols. So if you're interested in World War II or submarines, JJ highly recommends this book. Her second book is Custer's Fall by David Humphrey. This book is the Indian side of the story of the Battle of Little Bighorn. The author interviewed many Native Americans who were in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And in the source section of the book, the author gives a chapter-by-chapter detail of where the author got all of the information. So it is a different perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Okay, so the next review I'm going to share is from Patrick. He read the book Say Nothing by Patrick Keefe. And this book uses a 1972 kidnapping and murder to tell the larger story of the Troubles, a 30-year-long period of violence in Northern Ireland. Patrick says, although there are many people involved in the story, the focus throughout remains on 2 women, Dolores Price, a celebrated provisional Irish Republican Army member, and Jean McConville, a widowed mother of 10 living in Belfast. This book presents terrible acts, but the reader does come to understand how people become radicalized and how difficult it is to arrive at the truth of an event during wartime. Patrick says that Say Nothing is an outstanding instance of narrative history. He says it also, in light of the repercussions on the lives of everyone involved, one of the saddest stories that he's ever read.
And our last review is from Farida. Farida read Accidental Archaeologists, True Stories of Unexpected Discoveries by Sarah Albee. This book is about how ordinary people accidentally stumbled upon some very big and major discoveries in history. She said among the finds are China's terracotta warriors, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Thailand's Golden Buddha statue of Wat Tramit, and many more. She says this was a very interesting book that can appeal to adults and young adults.
So thank you to everyone that submitted reviews for this month. If you read something for this month's topic and you didn't get a chance to send it to us, please feel free to leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you read. Our next topic for August is going to be biographies and memoirs. So any biography or memoir that you want to read, just go ahead and send that to us. If you are not on our email list, if you visit our website, allenlibrary.org, go to events in the top menu and then select book clubs and scroll down to the Let's Talk Dewey book club. You'll find both my email as well as Abby's email, and we would love to add you to our email list.
We'd also like to quickly promote our Next Read service, which is available on our website, allenlibrary.org. Next Reads is our personalized book recommendation service. You have 2 options. When on this, you can either click to receive a personalized PDF form of about 3 to 5 book recommendations, or you can click to receive a library bundle. So the library bundle is about 3 to 4 books that based on your recommendations and your suggestions that you give us, and we will actually find books in the catalog and place them on hold for you to pick up. So check out our Next Read service on allenlibrary.org.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.